Welcome to the Misophonia Podcast. This is Season 5, Episode 7. My name's Adil Ahmad, and I have Misophonia. Well, this week marks the second anniversary of this podcast. And to mark the occasion, there are really few people I could think of that have had as big of an impact on misophonia awareness as my guest. And by the way, a few of the other ones are still coming up this season, and I'll leave them as a bit of a surprise for now. But today, I have Dr. Jennifer Brout. If you've been reading about misophonia long enough, it doesn't take long to come across Dr. Brout, who I get to call Jennifer on the show. She's a psychologist and misophonia sufferer, and parent of a misophonia sufferer, who has been pushing very hard for misophonia awareness and research since the 90s. She co-founded the Duke Misophonia Research Center and is co-director of MisopphoniaEducation.com and the International Misophonia Research Network. She has written a number of articles about misophonia over the years, and books, including the new one, Regulate, Reason, Reassure, a Parent's Guide to Understanding and Managing Misophonia. Jennifer is especially interested in understanding and helping children and families with misophonia. She, as many people know, is very passionate about misophonia, and this was a very fun and thought-provoking conversation that went into places I didn't expect, like memory reconsolidation research. Before I get to all that, I also want to welcome our new Patreon sponsor, who wants to stay anonymous despite my promise of giving a shout-out to anyone who supports the show on Patreon. If you want to join, please go to patreon.com/misophoniapodcast. I'm hoping to get human-reviewed transcripts of every episode to have online for anyone who is more inclined to read about these experiences heard here, as well as also for anyone who wants to use the information here in research. And of course, check the Patreon page for more information on all the swag I'm giving away to patrons. Even if you can't do Patreon, please share this episode on social media. It's a great way to raise misophonia awareness without having to write like a long post about your own experiences. You might introduce another misophone to the term and start a conversation. In the meantime, you can follow the show at Misophonia Podcast on Instagram and Facebook, or Misophonia Show on Twitter. All right, that's enough about the podcast. Let's get right into this week's conversation with the legendary Dr. Jennifer Brout. Well, yeah, let's just, jump into it. And let me just say, Jennifer, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Adil.
Do you want to, in your own words, would you like to kind of tell
Sure,
people
I'll
kind of
make it brief.
who you are?
I'm a psychologist. I have misophonia. One of my children, who is a grown-up, has misophonia, and I've been working both in terms of trying to get research started back in the 90s on this disorder that at that point had no name. And I founded a program with Dr. Rosenthal at Duke many, many years ago. And I have done a lot of, research advocacy is what I call it. So advocating for research before the disorder had a name. And I work with mostly children with misophonia and teenagers with misophonia. And that's my background.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure a lot of people listening have either, read your articles, whether it's in Psychology Today or whatnot, or probably maybe read your book, attended your seminars. I haven't talked to many psychologists or professionals who've known about misophonia dating back to the 90s. So curious about kind of how that came about. Like, how long did you know you had misophonia, and how did you put the pieces together in terms of, wow, this is something that I need to pay attention to separate from other conditions?
For me, sorry to interrupt, it would have been dating back to the 1970s, or maybe even the 1960s, as I really age myself there. I always knew that I had some kind of sensitivity to sound. Now, of course, I wouldn't have called it misophonia. I just knew that sound really bothered me. I didn't know that it was really specific sounds, although I think as I got older, there might have been some awareness that it was particular sounds. And for me, and I don't want to, name triggers, but it was very specific trigger sounds in a certain realm. And but when I had my kids, I have triplets and they're 27 now. When I started to see what was happening with my daughter, who showed symptoms very, very young, we're talking 2.5, 3. So when I started to see that she was reacting to sounds, well, to back up a little bit, I started to see that she was just having, I mean, I go back to being a mother and not knowing how to
Hmm.
describe it. And I have no words, but, just completely flipping out of nowhere. I started to put it together. This is sound based. And she would say with her little tiny 2.5-year-old voice, no chewing, no chewing, no chewing. So it started to become
Oh,
obvious to me. Uh, and, I went to a number of psychologists because I was a psychologist. And I was told that I was crazy. And, you know, um, I said, but I have this thing too. And I started to talk about my trigger sounds. And, we were just told we were crazy. It didn't matter that I was a psychologist. And
yeah.
I found some solace finally from occupational therapists who at least had a term for being over responsive to sensory stimuli called, over responsive, sensory over responsivity. And within that was something called auditory over responsivity. So at least while they were not necessarily able to treat it, at least they did not treat my daughter like she was crazy or
Mm.
me. And OTs were able to help us kind of learn to just work with our nervous systems. I went through OT pretty much with my daughter, um, and helped us to learn how to self-regulate a little bit. Um, it was hard to get it to work in the face of a trigger sound, and that's what my book is about. Um, and sort of that's the history. And so what I tried to do is bring together what I learned from occupational therapy into psychology, and that's how I ended up starting the program at Duke.
Gotcha. Okay. And that program at Duke, I think, started some years later in the mid 2000s, I believe, or was it a little
Yeah.
later?
Uh,
Yeah.
Now I'm going to be pressed to remember the exact date,
Oh, it
but yeah,
doesn't have to be exact.
I think in the mid
Actually, we need
2000s.
to know down to the hour. But
So embarrassed that I don't remember. Um, but yes, and it was originally called the Sensory Processing and Emotion Regulation Program. And, my goal was to get psychologists to understand that there is something else going on here beside just, I mean, the names for it ranged from, okay, you have oppositional defiant disorder, which really got me so angry. I mean, my
wow,
child
I've
was
never
not
heard of that. But yeah.
oppositional defiant, which is a stupid
Yeah.
classification anyway. I was not oppositional defiant. Nobody, so part of what I was doing, because I was working on the DSM on a team to get sensory processing disorders into the DSM-5, which it got in under autism, just a couple of sensory over responsivity and under responsivity, but the whole thing didn't get in. But that's a whole nother story. So eventually, I came to understand very clearly that misophonia is not the same as auditory over responsivity. And, you know, clearly it is not the same disorder, but some people do have both. And some of the skills from occupational therapy sensory integration training can be used because they're bottom up. They work on the physiological, neurophysiological calming. They're not just cognitively based because, and again, this is what my coping skills method is about. You know, when you're in that misophonia moment, cognition cannot be accessed. And
Right.
I find it, I mean, at least it can't for most people that I know with misophonia. So, cognitive work is great as an adjunct, how you feel about the disorder, maybe how you feel about living with the disorder, but it's not going to help you in that moment. You need to use skills that calm the autonomic or sympathetic nervous system arousal. Otherwise, another way to put it is a fight flight system.
Hmm.
So I'm blabbing and I'm not letting you ask me questions. I'm sorry.
No, no, no. Actually, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you next was like kind of the history of kind of your development of your program or your basically when did you start kind of thinking about treating misophonia in your clients, and kind of how did this like maybe a little bit describe like what is this regulation method that you have?
Well, I was very fortunate when I was in school, and I was actually in school before and after I had my triplets. And I had some really amazing professors. And this is very interesting, actually. They were infant mental health specialists. So when you think about when you're dealing with an infant, you can't rely on cognition and you can't rely on behavior therapy. You're
Yeah.
relying on the nervous system. You're dealing with their physiologic system. Yes, you may call it emotions. My baby's upset, the baby's upset, but all of the systems are so intertwined with infants. And that's when I learned, oh, I get it now. We grow up, but we're really still driven by the same things. And the other part of what really made me understand what's really going on, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but I became close friends with really just an amazing neuroscientist, Dr. Joseph E. Ledoux. He's also a really great musician, but that's another story.
Ooh,
And
I'm interested in that too. Yeah.
yeah,
Anyways.
yeah. And you could try to get him on, it'd be great. And so he was the neuroscientist who, way back in the 70s, when neuroscience wasn't even really a field, traced the fear circuitry, which he now calls the defense circuitry. So we're talking again about the amygdala, which is where fight, flight, and I use that just to simplify it, it's really fight, flight, freeze, is mediated.
Mm-hmm.
And what he has explained to me, and I don't do him justice, so if he's hearing this for some reason, Joe, I apologize. We talk about emotions and emotion regulation, but when Joe explains what an emotion is, and we have some great videos of him doing this, by the way, when he explains what an emotion is an aggregate of both the physiological and many neural systems. So within an emotion is the physiologic, so and the cognitive. And when we have, for example, and now I'm adding to what Joe said. Joe didn't say this part, but when we have a misophonic response, or we're in that moment, this response happens in a millisecond. That's how fast, I'm going back to Joe now, that's how fast that amygdala responds. And we are in that sympathetic nervous system arousal within a millisecond. So it is very hard to parse out cognition from emotion from what your body's doing. And that is what is so incredibly unique to misophonia. Now, you could say a panic attack is somewhat similar, but the difference again with misophonia is there is an external stimuli or stimuli that is setting a person's physiological self off. Mm-hmm. And that, if you think about it, really, unless you're talking about some elements of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is absolutely, not related. I mean, can be related, but it's not. I don't want to confuse anyone that, misophonia is not based on trauma. But in a sense, we are dealing, it's the only other disorder where we're dealing with external stimuli is affecting the physiology. Whereas like in anxiety, you can be thinking about something and that can set off the nervous system.
Right. Anxiety, it can be nuts. doesn't have to be stimulated by something external. It could be your mind starts to drift in a certain way, and then it just kind of snowballs. But misophonia is very much external stimuli. Millisecond
Yeah.
later, everything's
Yeah.
changed inside your head. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I think, these are the kinds of thoughts that I have, parsed out about misophonia. And I get somewhat upset because I don't see this coming out in the literature except for some of the really good neuroscience.
Is Ledoux, did he write the book The Synaptic Self? Just to go
Oh,
on
yeah.
a little tangent. Okay, I have that on my bookshelf. So I've known about him for a while. Because I was coming at it from the synaptic self from a kind of computers programming perspective, which is totally off topic. But
Oh,
but yeah,
oh,
but it's amazing that this is long before I knew what misophonia was. So it's kind of an interesting intersection here.
yeah. Well, when you're talking about the defense response, anytime you have sympathetic nervous system arousal, the amygdala is involved, and he is the amygdala guy. He's the person who studied the amygdala first before anyone.
Yeah.
And he's just, he's a very brilliant neuroscientist. And a lot of his work was really, underlies what everyone else is studying in terms of the amygdala and the defense response. And I guess his first book, I think, was The Emotional Brain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've heard of that one. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, he's been on a quest to define what is an emotion in the brain. And what he has finally said is emotions don't sit in any part of the brain. Emotions are an aggregate of many different parts and systems of the brain and physiological functioning. And I think that's
Right.
important when you understand misophonia, because, we can say it's an emotional response. And yes, it is, but it is also very much a physiologic response or neurological response. And that's why when I talk about coping skills, you have to do this self-regulation or even co-regulation first.
Well, what do you mean by
The way
self-regulation versus co-regulation?
Well, self-regulation and co-regulation, again, going back to sort of infant mental health and somewhat to what occupational therapists brought to the table, all the way back to the 70s, but more so really in the 90s, is this idea of working from the bottom up rather than the top down. So working from ways to calm your body. And there are numerous ways. They're not a panacea. They're not a cure-all. But the idea of focusing on your body and using your sensory systems to bring down the sympathetic response. Because really, you want to bring in the parasympathetic system, which puts the brakes on fight flight. Rather than standing there in the middle of the misophonic moment, trying to talk yourself out of it.
All right.
Because you can't.
No, we've tried.
Listen, if we could talk ourselves out of it, then we wouldn't have.
We'd be rich. Somebody would be rich. Yeah.
Right. And we wouldn't have these problems. The same with exposure therapy, which is another thing that makes me very distraught. I'm sorry, you didn't ask what makes me distraught, but I just.
Oh no, we were gonna. Yeah, I wanted to ease into that because I know, I know you have. Most of us, especially someone I'm sure who's been around misophonia for a while, you've got some, strong opinions about what's out, and there's a lot of conflicting stuff out there in the literature. So it's an unknown, misunderstood, often dismissed disorder, and it's only natural that we're all passionate about it. So. Well, yeah, maybe you mentioned a little bit about things you're not seeing in the literature. Are there things, I'd love to get to kind of where you'd like to see research go, but I'm curious, like, are there directions that you think are maybe not as fruitful, that maybe are maybe confusing people?
Yeah. So first of all, exposure therapy, which is to some extent is misunderstood. Irregardless, there's no reason to understand it because we don't need it for misophonia because it doesn't work, and it in fact is very harmful and at best uncomfortable for those of us with misophonia. And, unfortunately, I've had this out with a number of psychologists, and not every psychologist wants to do exposure therapy. But, what happens is, you go to a psychologist or you go to an audiologist or you even go to an occupational therapist, let's say, and there's no protocol for how to treat this disorder because there just isn't yet because we don't know enough about it. So what does somebody do? They do what they think is going to work. They think, well, let's say for phobias, maybe for OCD, exposure therapy works. And so they think, well, I'll try that, which, to some degree is irresponsible, in my opinion, because it is not a phobia. And
Right.
I would rather work on coping skills than treat somebody with something that is going to backfire. So, exposure therapy is based on the idea that one will habituate. So, that means that one will desensitize to the sound. I don't see that happening. I've never seen that happen. And there has been a few papers written that, once, I'm not going to mention any names, but a particular person said, oh, I sort of had it out with him. And I said, no one's habituating. So what are you doing? No one's desensitizing to the sound. So what are you doing the exposure therapy for? And the answer is distress tolerance. And I said, no, thank you. Okay. Basically, what you're doing is saying you're exposing somebody to these sounds so that they can learn to like grin and bear it. I said, that's not helpful. That's not treatment. That's not helpful. What are you doing? I'm getting very dramatic because I do get very passionate. And, so that's something that is going on out there. And I would say to anyone who goes to a psychologist who tries to do that, leave. Sorry.
Fight or flight or flight, fly away. Yeah, I mean, it's something that it's. I guess it's. I was curious where that came from, and I think you made it. You made it obvious that it comes from probably OCD and treating phobias, and maybe it does work in those domains, but this is quite different. I mean, I don't know anyone who, when you mention exposure therapy, who has misophonia does not cringe and just and it's at least to us it seems intuitively the wrong direction. But and so what are some of the so you said like focusing on maybe focusing on the body during the moment, or is it things like kind of focusing on your breathing or focusing on your senses, maybe other senses other than hearing? Is that kind of what you're
not exactly. But that's actually not a bad idea.
It's a total guess, right?
Good idea, actually. That's one of the wonderful things that has come out of, there's a great, I think this site is now sensoryhealth.org. One of the great not ideas, but that it's actually a huge body of research that has been validated and proven that's been ignored by psychology because guess what? Psychologists, I sound so anti-psychology, but psychologists and psychiatrists to some degree don't want OT taking over their turf. So there's always turf wars going on.
Oh, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that. Anyway, continue.
So, and while some of it's been, there was a great attempt in the early 2000s to kind of integrate, and that's when I was on the DSM group trying to get sensory processing disorders into the DSM, which is run by the American Psychiatric Association. And, I don't want to point fingers, but I don't think they wanted it in there. So, but from OT, particularly these sort of sensory-based theories and practices, we know, for example, that certain things are innately common. Certain things are innately calming, rather. And we know this also from infant health. So if you think of like an infant, okay, rocking, what do we do with infants? We rock them, we swaddle them, we put sort of pressure around them. Think of what we do to calm down. I mean, it's almost so simple. To calm down physiologically as an adult. We like massage, right? Not everyone does, but many of us do. So the idea is, how do you take these things that will change? And there are certain breathing exercises that are also helpful. But here's the problem. You can you can do a massage and then you come home and you're still triggered. Although leading a lifestyle where you're trying to keep in sort of lower sympathetic arousal is good. But the idea is to take these movements and these proprioceptive input, which is known to bring in the parasympathetic system, which again breaks fight flight, and get them into the misophonia moment without looking ridiculous in public. And that's what took years for me to really figure out, because even if you go to an OT, they have ways for you to do things and you'll feel, let's say you swing on a swing. Okay, let's say vestibular calms you down. Vestibular sense calms you down. You can go swing on a swing, think of what little kids naturally do. And then we stop doing it. Or maybe some of us continue in the form of sports or swimming or whatever. But all of these things that are innately calming to infants, to little kids, swinging, rolling, these things are innately calming. Massage, pressure to the muscle and joints. But how do you get these into that moment? So it took me a long, long time to figure out, what can I do to take these kinds of motions and put them into a moment. So that moment when you are escalated. And so I have these very specific kind of little tricks. For example, we all know stress balls don't work for misophonia.
What about fidget spinners? Just kidding.
I mean, fidget spinners for some people are okay as a distraction-ish, but not necessarily, they're not the end-all be-all.
I was kidding. I think all parents from 2 years ago are sick of those. But
yeah, right, exactly. I can't watch a fidget spinner because I can't.
Right, there's a visual trigger too.
When your misophonia and your misokinesia, whatever, like collide, that's a whole other thing. But so, I use often, and the disclaimer being, please nobody hurt themselves. But I use like a hand gripper often, which you use in physical therapy, and musicians use them. And this gives you a squeeze that is hard. So this is not like a little squeeze of a stress ball. This is like a hard squeeze. So that pressure tells your brain lower arousal. So there's all kinds of tricks like this. Even if one is sitting in a chair and you push down as though you're trying to push yourself up from the chair.
Right.
That will tell your brain, slow down. And there's many of these. So these are the kinds of things you can do in the moment. And there are other things, of course, if you're at home and, you don't care what anyone's thinking, you can get up and do wall push-ups. You're changing your physiology. That's changing your physiology.
Interesting. So you get triggered, you get up, do some wall push-ups, and that kind of tells you, is one way to kind of tell your brain to calm down.
Yeah.
Or just changes
change your physiology. And then you can worry about your cognitions and your emotions. And if you have to leave the room, do some wall push-ups. Listen, if you can, do some actual real push-ups. Or there's another thing I call an adrenaline release, which is, if you have to go out of the room and, do some fast wall push-ups, do some jogging around the house, whatever you have to do, release the adrenaline because it's in your body. How are you going to get that adrenaline out if you don't do something? You have to bring it down by bringing in the parasympathetic system, or you have to release it. So you have to deal with what's going on physiologically first. And what's interesting, Adil, is that most people, when I ask most people, how long does it take you to sort of calm down when you're triggered? Most people will say it takes me 2 minutes. Some people will say it takes me a half hour. When most people actually kind of just time it with something as simple as, and kind of gross, and this isn't scientific, but let's say heart rate. Most people find that when they are away from the stimuli for like 30 seconds, they go back to what we call homeostasis, which is the neutral state. Once you
Mm-hmm.
know, and that doesn't mean there aren't people who don't continue to sort of ruminate on the sounds, and that's a whole other story. But for most people, you get away from the sound, the whole thing stops. So if you need to go in another room, reset yourself, and come back, that's okay. That's not, you see, psychologists would call that avoidance, and I call that taking care of your body.
Yeah, I call that, yeah, my normal MO.
Yeah,
I call that
I call that
Adil's
my life.
thing he does. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, getting the energy out, even doing the wall push-ups, it's almost kind of you're maybe a more productive fight or flight because it's fight or flight and it's kind of like uh, you're kind of yeah changing your physiology, getting your mind off, moving your body, getting the energy out.
yeah,
It's I guess maybe yeah more directed form of fight or flight. You're not yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and the cognitive stuff that I do really work on is to not do not go with the narrative that people are your trigger. I mean, we know that people's sounds are certainly the worst triggers for most people. But and we don't know why, although Sukhbinder Kumar's new paper definitely kind of starts pointing us in a direction that we could begin to understand it. The motor basis for misophonia, which I'm sure you've read.
Oh yeah, yeah. We had
Uh,
Merced on the
oh,
podcast. So
I should have mentioned her as well.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
Fascinating paper, and just you know, and when you think about it, if there is a motor component to this, then moving is the best way to combat the trigger, the reactivity to the trigger. So, so just for the people listening, so what Sukhbinder and Mercedes, and I apologize that I don't know everyone else's name on the paper by heart, pointed out is that when somebody is triggered, the primary motor cortex lights up. And what they hypothesize is that mirror neurons are, there's a hyper mirroring going on. And what mirroring refers to is, and this is an example, when a baby is looking at its parent or whomever, and it learns motorically how to smile back, those are, for example, mirror neurons working. So we have within us these specialized neurons that help us to motorically mirror someone else's motor movements. So the auditory and the visual are conduits to the mirroring. So just to give you an example, if I'm watching someone chew or if I am hearing someone sniffle, I'm feeling it in my body. That's the hypothesis here. And that's what showed up in the neuroimaging that this team did. And that takes us in a whole other direction for potential treatment and just for potential understanding of what this disorder really is. It's a game changer paper. So if you ask me what research I want to see done, I want to see more of that.
yeah.
But also, if you think about the fact that there's a motor component, if I'm feeling someone's invading my space, maybe, I don't know, then moving is really good. So back to the coping skills, when I saw that paper, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe this kind of makes sense why this is somewhat helpful and why, but the cognition part, the narrative of the person, is my trigger, is just not helpful. It just doesn't help.
Right. No, and I think most people who have thought about misophonia enough, who have misophonia, I think at least by the time they become an adult, have rationalized that. Okay, I try to, most people have said to me, I realize now it's not the person, it's just I can't process certain sounds properly.
Mm.
But yeah, hopefully nobody's evangelizing that it's the other person is doing it on purpose. Although I have heard stories where some people will use it kind of as a weapon, but that's a whole other
I know.
that's a whole other topic.
It happens.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, and then like you said, the paper is a game changer. It does, it leaves some questions and opens new questions in terms of things like, well, then are people maybe born with this condition within the mirror neurons, or do you have any, I don't know, thoughts about what maybe causes this in people in the first place?
I really have no idea.
And that's a totally fair answer.
I am clueless. I don't know. I really don't know. And it's such a great question. I do wish that, I mean, there is this myth that, it begins between 8 and 12. And I don't think that's a great myth to be perpetuating, because then nobody's going to study young children.
Right.
And, maybe most people report that they remember having developed these symptoms at age 8 through 12. But, what would a parent know what to look for? Like, if I didn't have this, I may have just looked at my child and thought, what is going on there? Taken her to a psychologist or a psychiatrist and accepted that, I don't know, the many diagnoses they offered me, from ADHD, oppositional, whatever, none of which were true at all. So what a parent doesn't know what to look for. So I would like to see more research in the developmental neuroscience
Mm.
area of misophonia, because we don't know
Yeah.
how it begins, why
And
this
if anyone's had time to think about it, it's you, Jennifer. So that's
yeah,
yeah,
I've had
totally
just
fair
all
answer.
to think about
Not,
it.
I'm not. I don't mean to age you. I mean, or
No,
whatever. But yeah,
it's
definitely.
really fun. I look so young in my picture. It was taken
But
so
you
long.
do.
I am looking at it. I'm like, oh, that's a lie. It's time to
No,
change
no.
that picture.
And you mentioned you mentioned trauma earlier, and in a lot of my interviews I've talked to people who either have comorbid conditions or have experienced trauma in the past. And that's come up as maybe something that can cause this, or at least maybe activate it. I don't know if you think you see kind of, you think that's kind of a coincidence, or are there any kind of takeaways or things that we can learn from trauma treatment that might help here?
Well, I think, well, yes, actually. And I know I did say before that this is not trauma, it's not caused by trauma, but maybe I spoke too soon. Um, what do I know? Maybe it is caused by trauma. I don't think it is in everybody's case.
Mm,
For example, many people have this and have no specific trauma, at least that they can remember. But what
right.
is trauma? I mean, birth is trauma. If we go back to the old analytic psychology days, somebody's, anything can be traumatic, to the system. Of having a flu or whatever when you're young can be trauma. And this is something I spoke to Steve Porges about. He's really, I don't know if you know who he is, but very, very clear
Yeah.
about trauma. He'd be a great person for you to have on too. So who really knows? But what is very interesting is that what should be studied, and I think this is happening now, which I'm really excited about. Daniela Schiller, who was a student of Joe Ledoux, who I was talking before, and now runs and has for quite some time her own lab at Mount Sinai, which is a hospital, very great hospital in New
Oh
York.
yeah.
And when Danielle was working in Joe's lab in, I guess it was the early 2000s again, it was another student of Joe's, and Kareem, oh gosh, he has his own lab at McGill now, and I can't remember his last name, and I'm so
I'll look
sorry.
it up. Yeah,
Okay,
that's fine.
so they were studying how memory consolidates. And I believe it was Kareem who had this idea, well, if you consolidate memory, maybe you can reconsolidate it and change the association of the connection between your body response and the stimuli that's bringing on the trauma. So, memory reconsolidation. So, I, at the time, got really excited. And I'm like, and they were working on it for trauma and in rodents, I should say. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the cure for misophonia. This is it. This thing's going to work. And I annoyed Joe for I don't know how many years. Then I annoyed Zach. I'm like, someone has to study this. Someone has to study this. And finally, I talked to the people at the Misophonia Research Fund. I'm like, please, please, like, talk to Daniela Schiller because she is one of the only people now besides Cream and Matt McGill studying memory reconsolidation in humans, not rodents. It is a very tricky thing to get to work. Now, it was kind of the whole thing was abolished, all the work, originally because people mistook it for changing your memory and deleting memories. It's not that. It's simply changing the body response to the memory.
Oh, interesting. So it was,
Yeah.
it was the regulations that you can't do this research anymore.
Well, it was, I don't know if the it was actually regulatory, but it was, it was not well accepted. And
maybe after the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, it got shut down.
You should, if you look at, Joe was involved in trying to correct the understanding of that. It was a whole
one of my favorite movies, but total coincidence.
and yes. So, but Danielle, continued, and I think I saw this. If I saw this correctly, and if I didn't, I apologize. But I think she is now studying memory processes in misophonia. And this has been my great hope. The problem is there's somebody also in Amsterdam named Merle Kint who uses memory reconsolidation for phobias. Now, I'm not saying, I have been told, even, by Joe, this memory reconsolidation in humans in and of itself is not developed enough yet to be trying it, for this, that, or the other thing. But going back to trauma, the way trauma memories work, where the external stimuli causes the neurophysiological response with emotional and cognitive consequences, that's similar to misophonia. And in fact, there was a paper that Mercedes did with Rau in Amsterdam, where they found an association between the symptoms, at least, were associated with PTSD. So I shouldn't have spoken so abruptly and said, no, this is not PTSD or caused by PTSD. I don't know the answer really, but again, outside stimuli causing this physiologic reaction steeped in the memory association between the outside stimuli and the amygdala. That is similar. That we know.
Yeah,
no, this is clear. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm glad we went down this this path because first of all, you mentioned a couple people. I'm scribbling their names down now that I need to talk to you. Yeah, no, but I just brought it up because it's I was looking back recently because it's been about 100 episodes. So I was looking back at some of the common patterns, and one of them has been kind of like trauma, unresolved trauma. Angry parents, drinking. A death in the family of a loved one, and then misophonia starting right after, or being noticed right after. So I just wanted to ask you if what you thought about that. So this is some interesting research that I'd not heard of before.
Parent blaming, because I think parent blaming, and maybe this is because I don't want to be blamed. No, but I think parent blaming is easy because parents are usually the people from whom your worst trigger sounds emanate. Um, and then I think about my kids, you know, and only one of them had this problem. So there's the other side of it. Um, but
Right.
I always say we only have one sympathetic nervous system. So once it's aroused and once it's raw, think of it that way, anything can come get it excited. And I mean that excited in a bad way.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know what I'm saying? So yeah, if you're already in any kind of overstimulated state, if you're, you know, just an oversensitive person, if your parents or your household is having issues, if you have a bad year with a bad teacher, whatever, if you're going through, who knows, anything, you're revved up already. So yeah, it could,
Yeah, that's the thing. No two people, yeah, have the same experiences. Like even siblings might see a whatever situation in a different light or different angle or different kind of state of mind going into it. So
I think, you know, there, look, we don't know if there's a genetic component. It certainly looks like it, just anecdotally. I can,
oh, okay, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
so it could be that. We also, people come into the world. I know this, I'll tell you, I used to think a lot more, much more behaviorally, like, oh, when I was a young parent, I really thought I was going to have a lot to do with how my kids turned out. And then once the three of them got here, I was like, oh my goodness. They came into the world with, what psychologists call temperament, which is another way to say kind of, just the way they respond to stimuli. I mean, I had one that was so calm. I had one that was really terrified of everything, which was my misophonia one, and the other one who just seemed to hate being a baby, and they were just, that's how they came into the world. And I was like, oh, it had nothing to do with me, at least in terms of my,
Hmm.
parenting. So that's when I took a full swing, and I was like, out of like anything, behavior. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't merits to behaviorism, but I took a full swing, and I was like, oh, wow, it was an awakening for me.
I've always thought about it. If there's a genetic component, it's maybe the environmental may or may not activate a potential genetic component where they're not mutually exclusive, but they're not. It's not one or the other necessarily.
Well, I think, what you're talking about is certainly epigenetics. And it looks
Mm,
like, in the field of genetics, people, geneticists are now talking about, for the most part, not nature versus nurture, but
right.
nature via nurture, which is, I think, what you're saying.
Right, right. Yeah, ultimately, yeah, our genetics are determined maybe over a longer time scale in terms of humanity. They're affected by the environment and nature. I mean, nurture.
Right,
So,
right.
so maybe going. I'm curious about you want to talk about like how you helped start the team. How you met up with Zach and started that research group. There probably wasn't a lot of people that who were kind of thinking along the same lines as you around then. Wondering, like, were you kind of talking to everybody, and then suddenly, Zach was most receptive? I'm just curious how. Yeah.
Yes. I had a small family foundation at the time. And I was like, okay, the only way I'm going to do anything here is if I offer, like, not that I'm saying this about
Money.
Zach. No, but he was like
Yeah.
he's like one of my best friends, and I'm not saying this at
Oh, he's
all.
great. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I love him dearly. But this is how hard it was to get any psychologist to respond, even with money. Okay. You said the word sensory and everyone ran, okay? Like in different directions. We said that in psychology. It was like, I don't believe in sensory was kind of the thing. And I'm like, hi, do you believe that you're hearing? Do you believe that you're smelling? Because those
Right.
are the senses. Anyway, so, um, I was like, okay, so maybe if I take some of this foundation money, and I offer it to do a couple of studies, maybe that's the only way to do this. And and the woman who I was working with in the Sensory Processing Disorders Foundation got really angry with me. And she's like, how could you do this? Like, how could you not give this money to us? And I'm like, look, I've got like one or two shots here. It's not a large foundation. And if this doesn't get into psychology, this is just going to get worse and worse because people are going to psychologists and being told they have, this behavior disorder or this personality disorder, when in fact, I think that this is a sensory disorder. So I stuck like the word funding in the into the
Yeah.
email, and I wrote about 10 psychologists that would you be interested? And I was looking specifically for borderline personality researchers because I had
Hmm.
a hypothesis that part of borderline personality was reactivity to auditory stimuli, that part of the affect dysregulation was that, and or that one could develop borderline person or was one could be at risk for borderline personality because one is always being dysregulated by sound.
Right, right.
So that was my hypothesis. And so I'm writing this, and like literally no one wrote me back. Except, and then like maybe a week later, I get an email from Zach. He's like, I'd be interested. Z. I'm like, oh, he sounds kind of cool too. And that's how it all started. And so the first paper was auditory and tactile stimuli. And I remember he was like, oh my gosh, almost every single person that we studied is sensitive to auditory stimuli. So it was like, I thought this is big breakthrough, big breakthrough, big breakthrough. The paper came, the paper went, that was that. Years go by, thank goodness Pavel Jostrobov comes around and gives this thing. And I didn't know if you gave something a name, it could turn everything around, or else I would have just given this a name. But, so that's how it started. And then Zach and I have been working together ever since, with some breaks in between. But, he's amazing, and he's done amazing work, and he is, he's great. What can I say? I'm very, very lucky that he wrote back.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear.
He didn't go
great.
running.
Yeah.
He didn't flee.
Right. Well, he doesn't have misophonia, so he's not a fight or flight kind of guy, I guess.
No, he is not. He's very calm, very well regulated.
Right, right. Well, I guess we have a few minutes left, and I know we could go on for hours, I'm sure. I'd love to have you back on in the future. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about kind of your current book, kind of where we can get it, kind of any seminars you have coming up, and
Sure.
maybe any final thoughts there?
Sure. So I wrote a book for parents called Regulate, Reason, Reassure. And the idea, it's a not, I wouldn't call it a manual. It's a guidebook for parents. However, clinicians certainly can read it. Anyone can read it. But it is talking about these basic principles, about how regulation has to come first. Then you can use cognition, reasoning, and weave it in. And I even talk a lot about how I do weave in cognition. So it would be great, to come back and talk about that. And then of course, reassurance is obvious because what this does to a family, what this does to a couple, you have to have lived it to know. It is so destructive to family life. And, again, I work with children and families mostly. So that book is available on Amazon, and it's free if you have unlimited Kindle. And then the other thing I started to do, I get a lot of phone calls and a lot of emails. And it occurred to me that, one of the most important things is understanding what misophonia is and what it isn't, to the extent that we know at this point. And, I work with Shaylin. She does all my it started with her doing my websites. Then we began advocacy together, and so we've been together for forever, and she's an amazing. I've never seen anyone work so hard, I have to say.
Yeah, everyone has read her stuff, and she's a huge advocate, and I'm hoping to have her on soon. Yeah,
just incredible. Such a hard worker, what she has done for this disorder. And so, I said to her one day, I said, why am I not doing classes? I said, I'm teaching every time I start with a new family. I'm going over the same thing. It's costing them a ton of money. I can't see as many people as I want to. There's got to be a better way to do this. So she took my book and she made it into a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Shaylin. And I do these classes now. So it's much more efficient for parents and clinicians. And, they don't have to like pay for single sessions with me. And I get to reach so many more people. And they get, a free copy of the book, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be working out really well. And this is at misophoniaeducation.com. And we have a small group coming up in January. And we also have updates from Duke Research and other researchers. So you can see it all on misophoniaeducation.com. We're open to any suggestions too, because we're always trying to think of new ways to efficiently reach people. So yeah, that's what I'm doing now. I still see people privately, and I often tell them, take the class first, and then if you have any more specific questions about your particular child, then we'll go over that. And now we're getting into also adults, because there's just so many adults that need help as well. So I'm developing classes for adults as well.
Okay, so your focus has been on children and families, which is huge, because there are a lot of parents who write in and they're just kind of like have no idea what to do, and
I kind of fell into that just because like nobody else was doing it.
And you're a parent of somebody with misophonia. Yeah.
But now I'm also an adult with misophonia, so and an old lady with misophonia. So now I'd love to start doing some things from that perspective too. Especially couples, because I am in a couple, within a couple, and I have found ways, coping skills that I use myself that I think would be very helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, well, we should definitely get you on again.
I'd love that.
Yeah, Jennifer, and I want to say, remind people, this is Dr. Jennifer Brout, because I know people have seen that name and many things they've read and things online. So just want to thank you in person for everything. Yeah, obviously everything you've done.
Thanks.
All the places that you've written articles and all the seminars and work you've done. There's not a lot of people have had this the impact you've had in terms of getting awareness out. So it's been life-changing for many people.
I have to say thank you to Zach and to Shaylin and to you. This was such a great idea, doing a podcast deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Such an honor to speak with you. Everyone listening, if you liked this episode, please share it, and don't forget to leave a quick review or just hit the 5 stars wherever you listen to this podcast. You can hit me up by email at hello@misophoniapodcast.com or go to the website, misophoniapodcast.com. It's even easier to send a message on Instagram at Misophonia Podcast or Facebook, and we're at Misophonia Show on Twitter. Don't forget to support the show by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/Misophonia Podcast. Music, as always, is by Moby. And until next week, wishing you peace and quiet.